I'm delighted to welcome Reveron and Nikolas Gvosdev, who are both professors of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and co-authors of U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Strategy, The Evolution of an Incidental Superpower, which GU Press published in 2014. So today we're going to be talking about continuities and changes in U.S. foreign policy and defense strategy since the book was published. So thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having us.
Okay, so I thought perhaps we could start with the subtitle of the book. What's the difference between an incidental superpower and an accidental superpower?
That's a great question, right? Because most people think of the United States as an accidental superpower, that somehow the United States just stumbled onto the world stage and power was handed to it, and it kind of ended up in a leadership role in the international community. We don't believe that this was accidental. The United States, particularly by the mid-19th century, was emerging as one of the world's great powers. It was playing, obviously, the dominant role in the Western Hemisphere. It was beginning to expand its influence in Asia, in the Far East, becoming more involved in European affairs. Even when we had the period of so-called isolationism of the 1920s and the 1930s, this was less a withdrawal of the United States as a country from world affairs and more the withdrawal of the United States from playing an active role in political and military management of affairs. So that this idea that somehow the United States was just tending its own garden and because of World War II just happened to find itself in a global leadership role is something I think that we both said is not quite an accurate description. But what we mean by incidental is that the United States also didn't have a plan. The United States didn't have a plan for how it envisioned the international order, how it envisioned the role that it would play, and it was largely in response to incidents, hence the subtitle, that an incidental superpower. And what has happened over the last 70 years or so is that the United States reacted often in an ad hoc basis to developments. The end of the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Cold War. The reality that France, China, and Britain could not play the policeman role that FDR had envisioned under his proposal for the United Nations organization. That the U.S. Body public had certain reservations about the degree to which the United States would be involved in the world. And so we evolved our position in response to specific events. And then over time, those incidental responses hardened, the concrete set, and produced the type of national security establishment that we have today, produced the expectations of the United States being a power that is forward deployed, forward engaged in the world, and which plays or seeks to play a leading role in every region of the world.
Thank you. So you describe in your book how the origins of the modern U.S. national security establishment lies in the end of World War II, and I think, as you're mentioning there, kind of Roosevelt's expectation that the U.S. would kind of manage global affairs with the Russians and with other powers, and of course it didn't turn out that way. And so, in a sense, Soviet expansion surprised U.S. policymakers. And so I'm wondering, Derek, if you can tell us how kind of a series of ad hoc responses to particular events, ended up creating the infrastructure of American power around the world.
Yeah, no, great. And to sort of add to Nick's last, response a little bit. So we're speaking for ourselves, personal views. We also work for the Navy. And so sort of the 19th century items that I would sort of emphasize that Nick highlighted, is the policy of Western expansionism, which had the effect of pushing out great powers from North America. We often forget Spain was a great power in the 19th century, controlled Florida. France, great power in 19th century, we bought the Midwest from France, Russia, certainly pushing out of California, buying Alaska and such. And then the other 19th century thing to sort of highlight, so these are our personal views, but we also work at the Naval War College. And our second president was Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he really advocated a global fleet concept. And the U.S. government and Congress in particular invested in the Navy, giving it the ability. And so this would be, again, kind of one of those incidents. There's a great story that we always like to tell. Roosevelt coming up to Newport to sort of shut down the college, and on his way up, he's reading Mahan's book and is just struck by it. And so again, this to us is sort of like one more incident. Had Mahan not been an accomplished historian and convinced Roosevelt the importance, maybe the U.S. wouldn't have done this. In terms of sort of the post-World War II defense establishment, I mean, the contrast we like to sort of highlight is you look at in the British case. So those war bunkers from World War II sort of were closed and then disappeared, literally, whereas the Pentagon, which was constructed during the same time, stayed permanent. And so we had this permanent structure. And I think there were a lot of lessons that were kind of taken about poor coordination during World War II, not only between sort of Europe and what was going on in the Pacific, but also within the Pacific and within Europe, just inter-service rivalry. And so there was sort of an effort to try to, build some structure, some institution, new laws, in particular. I mean, we sort of take for granted, but there was no Defense Department, until 1947. Same thing, the CIA, we think today is pretty important when it comes to national security, didn't exist. And then you had the legislative updates in the 50s. And then kind of fast forwarding a bit, you get into the 70s, the all volunteer force, which is huge because then this gives presidents and the Congress sort of a ready tool of volunteers who you wouldn't generate sort of the protest related to conscripts, draftees being used, such as during the Vietnam era, and then you get 1986 Goldwater-Nichols. The idea we're still not quite there. So I always try to highlight, for example, our boss's boss is the chief of naval operations. The chief of naval operations doesn't control naval operations. The title is sort of an artifact of before all of these defense reforms. Naval operations are done at sort of the theater level, done by naval component commanders through a joint combatant command. And again, that was, some sort of innovation, that it's occurred. And then maybe the last sort of point too, I'll raise, because I think it's important, is the reserves and the National Guard have also been operationalized over the last 30 years in tremendous way. And so, I sort of marvel a bit of what we ask Guard and reservists to do today, because you didn't see that, during the 1970s, for example. And so when you look at sort of the defense structure today, the active duty force is about the same size as it was during the Clinton era, so almost 30 years ago. But the Guard and Reserve has been very much operationalized, so the force is really larger, even though the numbers, don't tell the whole story.
Well, thank you for that historical overview. That's, I think, extremely helpful in understanding how we came to be where we are. So I wanted to zoom, if not to the present, at least to 2014, and kind of read back to you something you wrote in your book and just see how it sort of strikes you 6 kind of long years later. So you wrote, while administrations may change, fundamental US interests have not. Combined with this is an enduring idealistic vision of spreading the benefits of democracy to other parts of the globe. These perspectives guarantee that the US is not likely to return to an isolationist approach. Does that still ring true to you? Is the current administration an aberration that we'll look back on and as an anomaly, or how do you think about that quote 6 years later?
Well, I think that, again, in hindsight, someone can look at that and say, well, what about the Trump administration? Where does America First fit in all of this? And I think that there's both a correctness to that critique, but then there's also a way to overreact to it. So let me start first with the correctness. aspect, right? That what we've seen, and I subscribe to the view that the Trump administration represents the bubbling up in many ways of tendencies within the U.S. body politic, both in terms of our domestic politics, but also in terms of how we view our role in the world, our international posture, that have always been there, but were largely kept subsumed by what we used to call the bipartisan consensus in foreign affairs. And, if any one of the other 15 Republican nominees in 2016, candidates for the nomination, had won, we would probably be saying that bipartisan consensus would still be largely intact. And part of that has to do with an issue that we also raised in the book in the end about ossification, right? That there's a point at which the U.S. is doing things in the world which start to become bureaucratic repetition, or these are the programs that we've always had, so we're going to keep doing them. And what has happened, and I think the correction that we're seeing, even when we look at the president running for re-election, former Vice President Joe Biden as the nominee, is a calibration of America's role in the world and an understanding that you have to reconnect it back to doorstep issues of the American population. Because in the earlier period, America's global involvement was definitely linked during the Cold War to the existential survival of the United States, right? That the United States would not survive if it had withdrawn from world affairs, if it allowed the Soviet Union to dominate the rest of the world. Sooner or later, that would impact on America's own existence, its freedom of maneuver, its ability to run its own social affairs. What we've had over the last number of years is a sense that foreign policy, to some extent, was on autopilot, and it was assumed that America's leadership role in the world was self-evident to the American body politic, and then the 2016 election made it clear, both among Republicans, but also to some extent among Democrats as well, that it was not automatic that talking about American leadership was something that necessarily connected with day-to-day issues of the voters. So in that sense, I think 6 years later, we would probably revise that, or at least I would say. Derek might disagree or might have a different nuance on that. But on the other hand, what hasn't changed is there are still core interests of the United States that don't change from administration to administration, and that even the Trump administration coming in, if it sounded that it was going to take a different approach, has still had to grapple with them. The United States maintains a network of institutions which keep the global order functioning, which benefits Americans, whether it's our ability to import the resources or the goods that we need for maintaining our standard of living, whether it's the position of the dollar as the global reserve currency, which is an extremely important part of American power, given that we can essentially inflate our currency without paying the price of inflation in a way that other countries can't, or that we can borrow large amounts of money from capital markets and not pass those costs immediately on to the American taxpayer. Those things haven't changed. Securing the American homeland from attacks by weapons of mass destruction, that hasn't changed. Ensuring that there is a stable flow of energy to the developed economies of the world, that hasn't changed. Maintaining the nuclear balance and strategic stability with a post-Soviet Russia, that hasn't changed. Managing our relationship with China. What we may see now is a debate over what is the most efficacious way to do that, and we are seeing some challenge to the idea that we could incentivize China to do things our way, making them a quote-unquote responsible stakeholder. But the necessity of managing the China relationship is something that is still there. So these things don't change. Core American interests haven't changed. They may change over time if technology leads to differences. Again, something we had anticipated in the book, which is something that we've seen develop, that as technology changes the ability of the United States to source its own energy needs domestically and to in fact become not just more energy self-sufficient, but to become an energy exporter, it does potentially have longer term implications for how important the Middle East may remain to US policy. But for the most part, there is a degree of continuity from administration to administration. I think we like to look at the discontinuities. The discontinuities are always much more interesting, both for the media and for scholars and for the public to focus on. And that some of these issues are going to be passed right on to, if Joe Biden is elected November, to a Biden administration, and or if the Trump administration leaves office in 2025, will be passed on to a successor administration.
Thank you. If I could maybe just add a couple points. I mean, clearly there's a clean break with some Obama administration policies, the Iran deal, JCPOA, the Paris Climate Accord, some withdrawal from treaties, INF, open skies, robust use of tariffs. If sort of the criticism of sort of Clinton, Bush, Obama was militarizing foreign policy, maybe the criticisms of this administration is they've really sort of focused on the economic tool, which people had been calling for, and to sort of reduce the use of the military. And I think kind of within the context of our book, I mean, some of the questions I think President Trump is asking are sort of consistent. And, the first would be, given the U.S. is the largest producer of oil now, why should we still have the Carter Doctrine that declares a U.S. vital interest, the free flow of Persian Gulf oil? Would we still do that today? Given Europe is rich, why should the U.S. play such an important role in NATO? Given decades of war, why should the U.S. still stay in Afghanistan? Again, my personal view, I think the questions are right. And, there's other explanations. And to Nick's point, a lot of continuity, with the past. I mean, the pivot to the Pacific and sort of the bipartisan, concerns about China now. I mean, to me, that begins with sort of Hillary Clinton in a foreign affairs article from about 7 years ago. Counterterrorism operations still continue. That's still that 2001 authorization for use of military force. And so the U.S. is still doing all that in Somalia and Yemen and Libya and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Skepticism of international institutions. I don't think NATO or, say European members and Canadian member of NATO has ever spent enough money on defense to satisfy the U.S. So I don't think that's sort of new. And on the continuity, right, NATO has expanded 2 times during this administration. So I really think if it were an abrupt change, the U.S. would have stopped it. To sort of leave sort of this openness, on if it's Trump 2, or Biden 1. I think if it's Trump 2, the concern I gained from our allies and partners around the world, they might just sort of go their own way. I think we've sort of been in the U.S. Has been in sort of a holding pattern with our partners and this uncertainty. And when we withdraw from agreements, we can sort of put it in a domestic political context, but I think our international partners sort of start to view the U.S. as unreliable and untrustworthy. And so that's why I think this election, even though foreign policy probably won't be discussed very much, to me, it could be a critical turning point, though. If it's Trump 2, how the world reacts to that, or if it's Biden 1, how do you recover? Does this look like going from George W. Bush first term to second term, or Bush to Obama? So those to me are some of the big questions, because it's not clear, to Nick's point, how much space will a Biden administration actually have to maneuver? You look at the debt, right? The deficit this year approaching $4 trillion. The COVID-19 pandemic hasn't gone away. There's some real serious things going on in the world that the U.S. might not be able to do, go back to 2016 or 2017.
Right, thank you. So you mentioned COVID-19, and we are in the middle of a big incident right now. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, how the pandemic, if it does, alter, America's future role in the world as a leader, or its own view of its own self-interest and strategy?
It's a great question, because the pandemic has in some ways overturned the 9/11 paradigm, right? So that you may recall in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the major powers rallied. It didn't end great power rivalry or competition, but that all of the major powers, the middle powers, felt that they had a stake in dealing with the scourge of Al-Qaeda, that this was a threat to everyone, that the destruction of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon weren't just simply attacks on America, but were essentially attacks on the international system from which everyone was drawing benefit. And there was a degree of rallying. There was a degree of countries coming together, some unprecedented post 9/11 developments, the US ability to go into former Soviet republics of Central Asia with Moscow's blessing, the opening to Iran that occurred in those last months of 2001, NATO invoking for the first time in its history the Article 5 clause of the Washington Treaty, unprecedented level of cooperation with China, with the FBI opening an office in Beijing and working with the Chinese on these issues. And I think people assumed that the pandemic was going to be something similar, that the pandemic hits, once it becomes clear that this isn't something that's going to be localized to Wuhan and something that'll be dealt with, that you'd expect that countries would come together, they would find avenues of cooperation, they would put differences on the back burner. That is not what has happened. And I think that is what is very both interesting and potentially disturbing about the impact of the pandemic, in that COVID-19 is revealing mindsets in all of the major powers, not just the United States, that can countries use this to their advantage? Will their rivals and competitors be more weakened by COVID-19 than they will be? And therefore, is it worth it to cooperate, or is it better for countries and groups of countries to kind of work together on COVID-19 to exclude others in the hopes that you come out ahead and your rivals do not? And so we've seen the Trump administration, in terms of its approach to the World Health Organization, essentially not wanting the United States to be playing a role. The search for vaccines, which is very much not just a single global effort, but are coalitions or groups, kind of a Western transatlantic approach. The Russians have their approach and are trying to draw in a number of the middle powers. The Chinese are working on their approaches, and a sense that if and when a vaccine is developed, I think that there are real concerns that it wouldn't be shared globally, but in fact would be used as a tool in interstate relations. So I think that far from promoting this being an incident to promote closer global cooperation, we are seeing it aggravate great power competition. This then may become one of those incidental moments in the role that the US plays moving forward. I mean, it's too early, I think, to assess the overall impact of the pandemic, but this may be one of those moments, as 9/11 was, as the financial crisis of 2008 was, where we can see the continuity continues, but we can also see the discontinuities in the role that the US plays, who America's friends and partners are, and so on and so forth. But definitely for the last 7 to 8 months, the impact of the pandemic has been to really show the limitations of international cooperation and the extent to which it is becoming a every country for itself environment.
Thank you. Derek, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it reveals a little bit, again, on sort of the future. I mean, we sometimes forget that I think the international system speaks with an American accent. the modern international economic system born in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the UN system, right, San Francisco, Nick's background, headquartered in New York. And the US derives tremendous amounts of benefits. And so sort of that international dimension, though, seems to be breaking down a little bit. Instead of trying to repair the World Health Organization from a diplomatic perspective, the US reaction is to withdraw and sort of cede that space to China. And you can look in other spaces, the International Telecommunications Union, which is, old UN body dealing, back in the day with Morse code, to today looking at cybersecurity and cyberspace architecture, headed by a Chinese national. And so my concern would be the US withdraws from these international institutions and we start losing sort of that openness that's been characterized, what I would call more technical regulation than sort of a content regulation that I think, China, if they continue to sort of dominate in these spaces, in the international institutions, again, my personal view, I don't think it's in the long-term interest of the US to abandon international institutions. But when you sort of start seeing what seeds are being sown as it relates to our position with WHO, going back, decades now with the Human Rights Organization within the UN, that to me could be, again, one of these pivotal moments, incidental moments that Nick's describing. And COVID will sort of lay bare, not to mention how active internationally countries can be, just because their attention and the fiscal cost will be so great on their economies. In particular, I mean, you look at the infection rate, one of the things in the book we tried to bring out is, challenging the US is, again, it's not a new thing. We sort of date it, probably late 90s. I mean, we can do it with our France as our ally with the Vedrine comment about the US as a hyperpower. Certainly Putin, in 98 gives that raucous speech, about how dangerous the US is internationally, and then grows in the 2000s, with the BRICS concept, the sovereignty club, and we, talk a bit about that. And then that gets exacerbated by the Iraq invasion in 2003, counterterrorism, Guantanamo Bay detention, and so on. So this, again, might be one of those moments. The US has benefited tremendously from being engaged globally. But I'll leave it sort of a question mark in my own mind. What does the future bring? I can't really say.
Yeah, no, thank you. So we've got about 2 minutes left. So I wanted to ask you, I guess, building off that, I guess an unfair question, but if we were to be having this conversation again 20 years from now, will we be looking back on a period in which the US continues to be the world's leading power?
It depends, I think, to some extent on how we conceive of what American leadership is and what does it mean to be the leading power. I think certainly the unipolar moment is long gone. The idea that the United States can single-handedly set the agenda both at the global level but also increasingly in regions, that the United States can go in. And again, for example, we can take the Middle East. We've seen, in the 1990s, the United States was the only game in town for the Middle East. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The European Union was uninterested. China was not even beginning to really stretch out its position. The BRICS Brazil and India hadn't started their rise. And so when you look at the 90s in the Middle East, the United States was the game in town. It could set the agenda. It could lay out the parameters. Today, that's not the case. Now, the United States is not all of a sudden irrelevant in the Middle East. We still have a preponderance of influence. We still have important formal relationships. We are able to broker important agreements. But what we've seen over the last 6 years is a degree of Russian resurgence in the Middle East based on their assessment of their interests, and that Middle Eastern countries now once again have options, including American allies. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, Israel can turn to Russia if they feel that they can get something better or that they're not satisfied with something from the United States. Does this mean that the US is gone? No, but it changes the environment. And then the question is how does the US retain its leadership role? Does it try to impose it? Does it try to incentivize others? to accept that role? Do we compromise on certain things moving forward where we say we have a maximalist agenda, but we recognize we can't get all 350 agenda items we'd like, so we're willing to accept a lesser degree of success? I think that's the debate we're going to be having moving forward. It's not a binary, either the U.S. is a leader of the international community of nations, or the U.S. has now gone. It is a question of adjusting. Other countries want to adjust the U.S. role, and I think that's something, by the way, as well, that's very important when we talk about our competitors. And I know I may be just going a bit further here, but it's a key point to make. Even China and Russia, their goal is not the elimination of the United States. Their goal is to change the rules of the game, to give them a greater position, to put checks on America's freedom of action, to essentially say, America, you may be the chairman of the board for the foreseeable future, but we want checks on your power. We're not going to give you or accept a blank check for your leadership. So they're finding ways to raise the costs in certain areas, and then in other areas, they acquiesce or they back American initiatives. Similarly, our own domestic discussion, and this brings us back both to the 2016, the 2020 elections and moving forward, is what costs is the United States going to pay, particularly in our, what costs are domestic politics willing to pay for a U.S. leadership role? And I think a role where the U.S. is still the leading state is something that most Americans feel we draw benefit from. But a world where the United States is the only leading state or has to use power to prevent others from exercising more leadership in the international system, I think there's going to be a growing number of Americans that say that's too expensive. We don't want to pay those costs. We want to be really, have our seat at the head of the table, but we're maybe not going to be as anxious to make sure that there's no one else around the table with us. And so again, that sense of where we're going to compromise, some of this is going to be other powers will have more wherewithal, and some of this is going to be changes, I think, in the American discussion about America's role in the world as we move into the 2020s.
Well, thank you very much. That analysis and those analogies, I think, of the boardroom are very helpful. I'm afraid, although we could talk about this topic for quite a long time, of course, we're going to have to leave it there. But I want to thank you both again for being with us today. This was a really enlightening discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you, Al, and thanks to the press for bringing us all together.
You're welcome. It's been great. So I'll just say goodbye to everyone and hope you can join us next week, and stay safe, everyone, and take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.